Hi, Brandon. Welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Scott. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, lots of big changes going on in the industry. You've been in the industry for over 2 decades and have a broad background. So I know you've seen a lot of things, but this has probably got to be one of the biggest that you've seen.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting changes in our industry, but I think changes for the better.
Yeah. So we'll talk about the NAR lawsuit, and if you want to give just a kind of a brief summary of, okay, what is the lawsuit and what does it mean? Like, how did it come about and what's happened with it?
So the NAR lawsuit has been going on for many years, and right now there's about 30 class action lawsuits from buyers and sellers across the country towards the NAR, National Association of Realtors. So the lawsuits came about from a number of different things, the natures of the lawsuits. One of the things that the lawsuit was saying that our realtors artificially inflate the price of housing. They cause price fixing of commission rates, the realtors do. And the realtors unfairly shift the cost of a buyer's agent to the seller. And it disregards the lack of buyer's agent qualifications. Permits representation of free services by the buyer's agent and permits a low commission listing filtering in the MLS. It also obstructs fair negotiations of compensation. So that's kind of what the lawsuits are claiming that the NAR and its brokerages under its wings do.
Yeah. And so we have a settlement that's been proposed that has not been approved by the courts yet. And basically the summary of that is a couple of things. That proposed settlement says what?
So on March 15th, 2024, they actually did propose a settlement. And again, Scott, it's not been approved yet, so it's awaiting court confirmation. These changes that we're talking about are, if the proposed settlement is approved, are not supposed to take effect until mid-July. And that's what they're saying right now, as of today. Some of the changes, probably the two most important changes are going to be that participants of the MLS will not be able to advertise what the compensation to the buyer's agent will be.
In MLS.
In the MLS.
So that's probably a pretty important component to say. Compensation from the seller cannot be advertised in the MLS.
Correct.
It can be done outside of MLS, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Correct. So that's probably one of the major components of the settlement. The other major component of the settlement, it's going to require buyer's agents to execute a written agreement with buyers, outlining exactly what their fees are. So and in doing that, buyer's agents will need to, of course, show their value, show what they're doing for the buyer, and the buyer's going to need to agree to that.
Yeah. So there'll be some sort of written agreement, a contract, effectively, between buyer and buyer's agent that outlines representation and compensation. And we'll get into the details of that shortly. Any other changes?
I think the other changes are all the discussions about compensation need to be transparent. So they need to be disclosed to the buyer and the seller on who's paying what.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting topic. So we have a July this year deadline for change, which is an interesting portion for me. It's a thorn in the side for me a little bit, so we'll get into that as well. But the other one is the fact that it does release liability for some brokerages and the MLSs, and it limits liability as well. And that has nothing really to do with the consumer. The three main consumer points are representation, compensation component, and then there's the starting point, which is July.
Correct. Mid-July is what they're proposing.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about a buyer representation agreement being required, and what is a buyer's representation agreement, and is this a good thing?
Okay. So a buyer's representation contract, right? I think that's what they're changing the name to, right? So there was a lot of discussion about that.
So the current agreement, for full disclosure, I've been working with these for 21 years. So there's no shift in my business whatsoever. I've always had this agreement. Right now it's called a buyer's representation agreement. So it's going to turn into a contract, right? Oh, we definitely got to have the right definition there.
Buyer's representation agreement has been in place. I mean, it's always been around. It's always been provided by the Hawaii Association of Realtors as a form for us to use, much like how you secure a listing contract with a seller. The buyer's representation agreement was designed for buyer's agents to execute an agreement with the buyer, just like the listing agreement. That agreement does a few things. Basically, it outlines what the services are going to be that the realtor is going to provide as a buyer's agent. It outlines a time frame on how long that contract's going to be in place, how long you'll be working with that buyer. And it also outlines what the fees are going to be. The fees that the buyer is either going to hope that the seller is covering or not, And if it's not, then that discussion also has to be discussed when you're sitting down with your buyer's consultation.
Yeah, so for me, I look at this as an extremely good thing. This is something that's been needed. It's funny because the NAR has a code of ethics. We all adhere to those code of ethics. And one of the components of the code of ethics says you have to get basically anytime you're working with someone, you're supposed to get that representation in writing, which means sell side, which we do standard with a listing agreement, and on the buy side, so the buyer's agreement is something that's supposed to have been standard, but I would say a majority of the industry has not done that. And I'd probably put it at 99% of the industry has not done that.
Correct.
And so in summary, the buyer's agreement effectively is an agreement between buyer and buyer's agent on what services that buyer's agent is going to provide, what the compensation to that buyer's agent is going to be, how it's going to get paid, and then there's also going to be obligations of buyer and seller, buyer and buyer's agent at that point, and then there's a time frame that you're going to agree to work together.
Correct. So Scott, do you think the buyer's representation agreement, I know you've been using it for over 2 decades, with these new proposed rule changes, do you think it's a good thing or not?
I think it's great for the consumer. I also think it's great for our industry. I was actually really happy to see this come out in the settlement. I had talked to the Honolulu Board of Realtors at one point and said, look, and I said it controversially directly to get the attention that I wanted. But yeah, I think it's extremely good for the industry and it's extremely good for the consumer. And the reason being is because if you understand how things have been operated in the past, it's been typical even to today that the seller is offering some kind of compensation to incentivize a buyer's agent to bring a buyer. And 90% of sales, roughly 90% of sales, are done so through what we call a cooperating broker or a buyer's broker. And in doing so, what's happened in the past, which is a little odd for me, is that someone, and I probably get 30 of these a month, someone is on my website and says, hey, I want to go see this property. And most agents will get in the car and go show that person the property, and there's no discussion about qualifications, services, fees, how any of this works, putting a plan in place, etc. Why I think this is good is, for one, there now has to be hey, hold up, we're skipping steps here. We need to sit down, talk about my qualifications, talk about the services you need. Here's what I'm going to offer you in services. Here's what my fee is. Here's how it gets paid. And here's the time frame we're going to work together. That's going to change consumer behavior. If you have to go that route first, the consumer is now going to say, hey, wait a second, I need to kind of pay attention to this first rather than we just start working with each other, that's an odd concept to me, because the reality is if I want someone to come cut my yard, I don't call up a landscaper and say, hey, come cut my yard. You're going to call them up and say, hey, I'm wanting some yard service. They say, great, I'll come over. I'll take a look at what you need. I'll talk about the services that I have to offer for you for what you need, and I'll tell you what my cost is. Why that isn't done most times on the buy side in real estate, I don't understand, because you do it on the listing side. When you sit down with a seller, you discuss that. You discuss exactly, here's how we're going to market your home, here's what we're going to do to prep your home, here's length of time, and here's our fee. So the reason I think it's been done in the past without the agreements from so many people is fear, right? Fear that they're going to lose the client.
Fear of rejection.
Yeah. In other words, if they don't have a lot of business, and we've talked about this before, and I talk about it a lot, there's 7,000 active agents on Oahu, there's only 700 transactions a month. 90% of the industry can't do a transaction because there's not enough for them. And the percentages are 66% of agents do 0 to 1 transaction a year, 86 do 0 to 5, and 94 do 0 to 10. So, and you need to be doing 10 transactions a year pretty much to be able to make a living in this industry. So you're only talking about the top 6% of the active agents on Oahu that are doing enough business to A, make a living, B, have enough knowledge and experience by doing the number of transactions, know who the players are in the market so you can get deals done, and have the experience to walk someone through that process and have seen it all. So there's a large majority of the industry that's fearful that, hey, I don't want to have to sit here and talk about my fee because I don't know that I can add value at that point or explain my value. And
especially if you're newer to the business and just starting out, right?
Yeah. So where do most agents start out when they start out in the business?
With buyers. Yeah.
And why is that?
Because customarily the sellers pay the commission, so that discussion never has to come up, really.
Correct.
Right.
So what the discussion years ago was what? How would the buyer's agents justify value in the past?
The seller is paying the commission, so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, my services
my
are
service,
free.
well, yeah,
Right.
And that's kind of
that had been around,
yeah.
been allowed for a long time, but that's kind of been the unwritten rule.
Yeah.
Which is a big part of what this lawsuit's trying to get rid of is that component. It's not free.
It's not free. Yeah.
Yeah. So newer agents start on the buy side and not on the sell side, because on the sell side you have to sit down and justify value and talk about your service. And in order to be able to go through that process, you got to be a pretty experienced agent, unless it's auntie or someone who's good friends with you that just gives you the listing because they know you really well. Which then I would argue at that point is that the smartest financial decision, considering this is the biggest investment you're probably ever going to make.
Yeah.
Right. So most people, agents have not asked for the agreement, not sat down with people because one, they don't know how to. It's a fear thing.
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation to have, right?
Yeah.
This is what I'm going to do for you. This is how much you have to pay me.
Yeah.
If you're brand new in the business and just starting out, what are you going to do for me that someone else can't do? And why am I going to pay you this much, right? So in the past, it's a conversation that has never had to happen because the seller was paying the commission, and all that buyer's agent had to do was hope that buyer liked the home.
Yeah.
The buyer, besides wanting to buy the house, they weren't really concerned with the buyer's agent's qualifications and whatnot, in most instances. But that's all going to have to change. And that's why I think these changes, this NAR settlement, there's a silver lining in all of this. And we're going to see that in the next few months here.
Yeah, so I actually think it's going to change the consumer behavior and the realtor's behavior, because the realtor now actually has to sit down and justify value, and which also means they're going to have to explain the process. They're going to have to help the buyer put together a plan in a sense, and the buyer is going to pay more attention to things as well, because now they're having to sit down and discuss how this is going to work, which forces the consumer at that point to pay attention to who they are hiring and working with. Hey, I'm committing with you for X amount of time. And a lot of times we're working with buyers on average about 6 months, maybe longer. So those contracts are a lot of times a year contract.
I just heard this statistic the other day. The average buyer's agent works with a buyer from 8 to 22 months.
Yeah, that's 22 is a lot.
With no compensation.
Yeah.
If you're hoping that somebody, that buyer buys something, but a lot of times it doesn't.
Yeah.
So there's a big misconception about realtors that, we make all this money and we live such a glamorous life. There's a lot of work involved in that. Average realtor works 40 hours a week, makes less than $40,000 a year.
What successful realtor do you know of that works 40 hours a week? Have you ever known me to
work 40 hours minimum a week? 40 hours a week, right? You work weekends. It's pretty much, it's almost a 7-day-a-week job unless you set boundaries, right? So.
I argue it is a 7-day-a-week job.
Yeah.
Because think about it. When are people off? First of all, we're going to work our regular hours, or what you would call banker's hours, and then when people are off, meaning evening times and weekends, that's when they're available to see property. That's when they're available to discuss things. How many times do you go on vacation? I can't remember the last time I've gone on a vacation and not done work.
I'm always working.
My laptop is with me. Even when I was overseas, when I went to Brazil for the World Cup, I was doing work from Copacabana. When I went to Spain for my 40th to Barcelona, I was doing work, 12-hour time zone change.
Unless you're going to the moon as a realtor, you're going to be working.
Yeah.
You know, as long as there's connectivity and coverage, you're going to be working. Unfortunately, that's the profession we chose, but you know, it comes with the territory, right? So
yeah, you got to be wired a different way to survive.
a lot of people don't understand that. Like my wife works a regular, 9 to 5 job, and she doesn't understand. I mean, now she does because I've been doing this for so long.
Yeah.
She doesn't understand. Well, she didn't understand that. Why you got to answer the phone on the weekends, or why you got to, do this or do that.
Yeah.
I mean, we are not.
We're a results-driven industry.
Yeah. Correct.
Right. If we don't get the deal done, we don't get paid. So if you're working with someone for 8 to 22 months, and you don't close, you don't get paid.
Yeah.
Which creates a certain kind of behavior as well. Do you want to discuss how the agreement works?
Sure. So the agreement, it's a written agreement. It outlines, number one, the time frame that you're going to be working with that agent. It also outlines the compensation and how you're going to pay that buyer's agent. It also outlines the roles of the buyer's agent as well as the client. The buyer's agent's fiduciary responsibility will be to the buyer per that contract. But there's also some obligations that need to be discussed with the buyer side. And by executing that buyer's agreement, what it does is it does two things. It lets the realtor know that buyer is exclusively working with you. So you can give, as a realtor, you can give that buyer your 100% attention, your 100% fiduciary responsibility. You're working for that buyer full time. And vice versa for the buyer. It allows the buyer to feel comfortable that they have somebody working for them 100% full time, 60 hours a week, let's just say, on trying to find them the right property. And then once they do, guiding them through that process. Because it's a very intricate process. For the average person who's never done it before, it could be very, very, very overwhelming.
So to summarize the buyer agreement, the way it's structured is, I describe it this way. There's a discussion of services that are needed. What are the services that I'm going to provide that you need? Are we in alignment? Do we need to adjust them at all? Then there's compensation. How do I get paid? And then there's the length of time. And those are the kind of the three main components that I wrap up in a buyer rep agreement. Yeah.
In terms of buyer representation, what should consumers know starting mid-July?
Starting mid-July. So I think there should be a shift for the consumer. Anybody that's just gone out, either asked someone to see property online, or met a realtor at an open house and said, hey, let's start working together. I think what they should start to understand in July is they should be careful. They should have been doing this already, but they should be very careful on who they do hire at that point. And the reason being is because you are going to be entering into a contract. And if you're going to be working with someone for 8 months to 22 months, you need to make sure that's the right fit and they have the qualifications and they have the knowledge and the experience. So I kind of summarize picking the right realtor up in several different categories. One is knowledge and experience, someone who's been in the business not only for a long time, but has done a lot of transactions that way. Because what you're hiring is someone who's been through the lessons already, so you don't have to, and they can walk you through that process. Another is the type of property you're looking for, which is, say you're looking for condos in Waikiki. Well, you want someone who understands that condo market and understands Waikiki, so geographically and type of property. Then you also do want to find someone that has similar values and that you like and get along with, because it is a process and not an event. You want to find someone that you can get along with, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them. You're going to be sharing financial information. And in doing so, you want to find someone that you get along with. So all of that means that you probably are going to need to spend more time interviewing someone, getting to know someone, sitting down, having a conversation about, hey, what can you do for me? Mm-hmm. If I'm going to commit to you, where is the value that I get out of that? And am I going to be taken care of?
Yeah, I mean, I liken it to anytime you choose a professional for anything, whether it be a doctor, a lawyer, a dentist. I mean, you want to interview them, make sure that they have the same values, make sure that the expectations out of both parties. What do you expect of me? What do I expect of you? And of course, I mean, the compensation part. How much does it cost?
Yeah, I liken it to if you're going to have open heart surgery, right? Most people are going to go and get second and third opinions, and they're going to interview those doctors, and they're going to ask for not only credentials but recommendations, and kind of see if they feel comfortable with that person. You're probably not going to have open heart surgery with the person that's only done one open heart surgery before, right? It's a very important process. Well, this is one of the biggest financial commitments you're going to make, and you don't want to make mistakes. So choosing the right person is going to be important, and it becomes more important when you have to commit this in one.
And good service, it has a cost to it, right? Yep. And some people are willing to pay for that, and some are not. And maybe the people that aren't the people that maybe it's not a good fit, right?
Correct. Yeah. That's where it goes back to values lining up. Let's talk about compensation now. Compensation will not be allowed to be listed in MLS by the seller or seller's agent in the MLS.
Correct.
But compensation can be offered by the seller outside of MLS. So there's been a lot of news articles. A lot of it is almost head shaking because of the misinformation. So are buyers agents commissions going away? How is this compensation component going to work?
I don't think buyers agents compensation are going away. I still think that savvy sellers will still see a tremendous amount of value in offering a buyer's agent commission. Customarily, it's been that way for so long. I don't see it's just like the faucet's going to turn off. Like I said, there's value in.
So why not?
Why not?
Why won't the buyer's agent commission go away? So if you can't list the compensation in MLS, then there is no more compensation being offered, correct?
In the MLS. So sellers still, and I in my opinion, will continue to still offer compensation. It will be offered outside of the MLS. There will be discussions that the buyers and the seller's agents will have to have. It could also be offered in form of a seller credit towards closing costs.
Yeah. So sellers don't have to offer compensation.
Correct.
They technically didn't have to before. I think there was an MLS rule that I was never aware of that said
the clear cooperation rule.
Yeah, that said you had to offer some form of compensation. I was never aware of that rule. Okay, you offer a penny. Compensation has been negotiable for a long time, which is a little bit of part of the lawsuit. Which the lawsuit's not totally accurate. Partly what bothers me about this lawsuit is the component of not having compensation in the MLS because it removes transparency, right? To me, if you want the most trust, to form the most trust, you have, as much communication as you can possibly have. So, yes, it won't be offered in MLS, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to be discussed or offered. A seller doesn't have to offer compensation. Correct. Right.
They never did. It's always been negotiable. Yeah. So it's just,
But here's the issue that I have with it. It's not even an issue I have with it. Here's the discussion that the seller has to have, and the seller's agent at some point is, okay, let's talk about that. You don't want to offer compensation to a buyer's agent. Okay, well, 90% of buyers hire a buyer's agent to represent them. Most buyers are strapped to be able to afford being able to get into that condo or that home, whatever they're buying into, they're buying up to their max. They have a down payment, they have closing costs that they have to pay for. So if you don't offer compensation seller, you're now putting that burden on the buyer who you're probably going to, most buyers are not going to be comfortable with that, not even not comfortable, they're not going to be able to afford that. So at that point, you eliminate part of the buyer pool. On top of that, no buyer's agent's going to work for free, so there's going to be some sort of compensation. So if you don't offer compensation and you say, no, buyer, you have to pay for it yourself, all right, well, you've eliminated pretty much 90% of the market. The way that you get the highest price is supply and demand. You want the biggest buyer pool. So by not offering it, there's going to be many buyers who aren't comfortable with going through the process.
You're limiting yourself.
You're limiting yourself, which great. You've focused on the commission, and that's fine, but you're taking your eyeball off the net.
The bigger picture.
The bigger picture. What do you want? Do you want more money in your pocket when you leave? So in other words, I'll play it out like this. $500,000 you're asking for your property and you're offering no compensation to the buy side. I'm bringing the buyer and I say, seller, are you willing to pay my compensation? No. Okay, great. We can offer you $400,000. But if you're willing to pay my compensation of whatever it is, if I brought you $1 million, are you willing to pay my compensation? You're going to net $900,000. Or
it's a no-brainer at that point, right?
Yeah. So no, I'd rather have $900,000 than walk away with $400,000 or $500,000. Okay, what's more important? It's the net. Great. Okay. So the compensation isn't the issue here. It's the net.
Yeah.
So my concern is if you focus as a seller, if you focus on the compensation, you're going to take your eyeball off of the net. You're actually going to do net less because you're going to eliminate a large portion of the buyer pool, and therefore laws of supply and demand take effect, and you're going to get less activity, take longer to sell, and you're going to get a lower price. Because at that point, either the buyer has to be comfortable with paying the buy side agent's compensation, which there are going to be few people that can afford to do that, or you're entertaining unrepresented buyers. And unrepresented buyers have a 70% fail rate.
70% fail rate. I was just going to mention that.
Yeah. So what? Do you really want to basically be showing your property much less because you've whittled it down to say 10% of the buyer pool to people who only do this once every 7 years, who really don't understand the process and aren't sure how to go through it? And that's why they end up having the 70% fail ratio, which means they get into escrow and then they cancel and don't close for some reason, because along the way of that process, they decide to cancel because whatever reason, whether they're not comfortable or they come up against something that they don't understand and
they
can't
probably
get to
weren't
the finish line.
They don't have the guidance and supervision,
Yeah.
of a buyer's agent of a buyer that would have been represented by a buyer's agent.
So the seller doesn't have to offer compensation.
Correct.
In my view, though, there's consequences to not doing so. And so the question then is, okay, what different ways will buyer's agents get compensated doing this? The normal way right now, seller pays buyer's agents compensation. It's listed in MLS, we see it, and they pay us at closing.
Correct.
That's going to change because that won't be available in MLS. So how does the buyer's agent get paid?
So there's a number of different ways. Like you said, traditionally it's been the seller paying the buyer's agent's compensation. With the buyer's agreement, buyer's representation contract coming into play, that will be clearly outlined. The buyer will understand that. If the seller is not offering the full compensation that agreement states, then the buyer can either, number one, bring that into closing as a buyer's closing costs, or number two, maybe the buyer is offering half of what that buyer's representation agreement says.
Seller's offering.
The seller is offering half of what that buyer's representation agreement states, at which point it'll be a combination of the buyer and the seller paying that compensation to the buyer's agent.
So if compensation isn't going to be listed in MLS, how will buyer's agents get compensated at this point going forward in July?
So traditionally, buyer's agents are compensated through the seller. Come mid-July, that will change. There could be no compensation offered by the seller, or less than what the standard customary was. We're not allowed to say that, but so there's a number of different ways that the buyer's agent can be compensated. Number one is the seller can offer the buyer a credit towards their closing costs, which then can be used to pay the buyer's agent. Number two, the seller could be offering less of a compensation that is agreed upon on the buyer's representation agreement, which at that point would be a combination of the seller and the buyer paying the buyer's agent compensation. The last would be the buyer paying the buyer's agent directly at the closing table.
Yeah, so you're really going to have 4 ways that a buyer's agent can get compensated. One is the traditional way. Mm-hmm. You can write it in the contract, seller to compensate buyer's agent X amount. Mm-hmm. 2 will be, okay, seller to credit buyer X amount in closing towards buyer's closing costs. Mm-hmm. And then with that agreement in escrow that's executed between buyer and buyer's agent, that credit effectively goes to the seller, from the seller to the buyer to the buyer's agent. You could have the buyer can bring it as a closing cost in addition or it's a combination of the two, meaning the seller pays part in some way, shape, or form, either credit or directly, and the buyer pays part.
Correct.
I don't see the buyers paying compensation directly. I've had one client in 21 years that has paid my compensation directly by bringing it in as a closing cost. Most of the time, they say, I just want to wrap it into the loan. I want to wrap it into the contract. Yeah. And that's an easy way to do it. I can either ask for direct compensation from the seller, or we just ask for a credit from the seller to the buyer, and then it comes to us.
Yeah. The average buyer is not going to be able to pay the compensation out of their pocket. They're hard pressed to come up with the down payment alone and closing costs. Right?
Correct, which is the reason why it's going to be important for sellers, if they want to get the most money, that they're going to need to offer compensation. Otherwise, here's my conversation that I'm going to have with buyers, right? Here's my services, buyer Brandon. Here's our length of time. Here's my fee. My fee is $30,000, right? Let's say my fee is 3% of the purchase price, and you're buying $1 million property. That's $30,000. You're going to probably balk it. That's a lot of money, right? And I would have to justify my value at that point. Or you say, hey, this isn't worth it for me. I'm going to go to somebody else. But most likely, you're going to say, hey, that's a lot. I don't know that I can bring the whole thing in out of my pocket and do the down payment and do the closing costs. Okay, great. If we get the seller to pay for it, are you okay with that? Yes. If we ask for the seller to pay for it, are you okay with that? Yes. Okay, great. Then we can either ask them for them to directly compensate me or write it as a credit in the contract. Well, if we get to and then the conversation would be, if we cannot get that compensation from the seller directly, are you willing to bring in part of it as a closing cost? Yes, no, a certain amount. If they say no, then okay, then we're looking for properties where only the seller is willing to cooperate. I mean, it's an easy way to get around, which I've done a million times. But the conversation could be, I only want to see properties where the seller is willing to pay the compensation.
And that's going to limit the sellers, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's going to limit the buy side. Where I had the issue with this whole thing is you've taken the compensation off of MLS. Now, as a consumer, if you're only interested in looking at properties where the seller will pay the compensation, how the heck do I know where it is? What, I got to get on the phone with every single person? Hey, here's our compensation. You guys willing to pay it? Because we start looking at property and the buyer falls in love with the property. Oh, hey, we now have a roadblock that the seller's not willing to pay anything, and they aren't willing to give it as a credit. That's the easy one. It's just you give it as a credit. But it makes for an interesting dynamic.
There's a problem. You could have a problem with the credit part, right? If you're doing certain kind of financing and whatnot. Yeah.
Correct.
So that's another discussion.
Yeah. But all of this becomes a negotiation. So there's part of that's how it kind of plays out in the conversation that's going to come up, because there will have to be a conversation on, okay, here is the fee. You're fine with the fee, but how does that fee get paid to me? That's going to be a whole nother subject that we're going to have a conversation with the consumers. How do we pay it? Are you paying it out of your pocket? Do you want to finance it? Because a lot of it is kind of like a car in the sense too. Like a lot of people want to finance a car because they don't have the cash to go pay for it. Okay, hey, I want to finance that in. I want to finance those points, the closing costs, all the things that you do when you're buying a home already. You want to add it into the loan, which is where the industry is going to need to shift, right?
Yeah.
Lenders are going to need to shift. So
yeah, lenders are going to have to change some of their practices as well. It's going to change the industry.
Correct.
I mean, all the services around it.
Yeah. And that's part of the issue that I have is the rapid turnaround. And I liken it
the 3 months you're talking about?
Yeah,
July.
3 months.
Yeah.
You're talking about one of the biggest industries, and how I describe it is housing is one of the three basics of life: food, water, and shelter, right? Everybody needs shelter. Tesla came out in 2003. Are we all driving electric vehicles? How long has that industry taken for people to begin to adopt electric vehicles, right? And which means gas stations have to change when you go that route. Parts change, manufacturers have to change how things are done because the car is built differently. Okay, well, that's a slow moving process. Now you're taking an industry that's as big as the auto industry, if not bigger, everybody needs shelter, and you're saying, oh, hey, we're going to fundamentally change how we do things in a 3-month time frame.
3 months, right?
And the prime example of where that's going to be a problem is a VA buyer, right? Right now, how it's structured for a VA buyer, someone who has VA entitlements that can do 100% financing, government-backed VA loan, it says right now that buyers cannot pay non-allowables, non-allowable closing costs. Those non-allowables, one of them is your buyer's agent's commission. So the concept of seller crediting buyer and the compensation then coming to us is not allowed with VA right now.
Limited in VA, yeah.
Yeah, they won't allow it. So you can't write the credit component. Seller has to agree to compensate us directly. So if seller, let's take Eva Beach, for example. What's the percentage of VA loans in Eva Beach?
Probably like 90-something
80%, yeah, 80 to 90%, let's say. Okay, if you're a seller that says, I'm not paying compensation, you've eliminated the entire VA market, which is a majority of your market there.
Correct.
And you're not going to get the highest net. That's why I say,
right? Yeah.
But that's some of the issues coming down the pipe. That's where I have a little bit of issue. It's like, oh my God, you want to change this entire industry in 3 months and make it turn and pivot and adjust. So what's going to happen is that compensation component where we had one standard of practice, standard of practices are good in the sense that they put everybody on the same playing field for how things operate so that it's much clearer and much easier to operate things. Well, we're going from one kind of way of compensation to 4 or 5. That's going to create confusion
and chaos.
Yeah. And when the industry has to change on a dime in 3 months, the industry is not going to be fully prepared. Who's going to take the brunt of that? It's going to be the consumer, because it's going to be frustrating for the consumer, right? Yeah. Which all the more reason goes back to me is the importance of who you hire matters, because the agents that have been in the business a long time, the agents that have been working with buyer rep agreements, and the agents that understand what's coming and how to pivot, those people are going to be worth their weight in gold, because they'll be able to talk that person through this process much easier than somebody who doesn't have the experience.
And that's the silver lining in this, right? I mean, it's going to elevate the real estate industry as a whole.
Correct.
And it's also going to maybe weed out some people that can't keep up with the industry.
Correct.
Are not able to,
or not willing to change.
Are not willing to change.
Yep.
So,
or those that can't show their value will phase out.
Correct.
Yeah. Which in my opinion, then you have a much smaller realtor pool.
A better realtor pool.
A better
quality for the consumer.
Correct.
I think.
Yeah. So next one then is, compensation. Everybody always talked about the 3% compensation component. I think the article that CNN wrote, the 6% commission is dead, or something along those lines. It was a pretty dramatic article. So why should a buyer go and represent themselves and avoid the fee at this point? Because if you're looking at let's call it $1 million property, and let's just call it 3% or 2.5%, that's $25,000 to $30,000. Why wouldn't the buyer just skip the representation process and go directly to the seller?
I mean, I think it's absolutely important for a buyer to be represented, to navigate the process. For the average buyer, it's very complex. Yeah, it's a very complex transaction. It takes 30 to 45 days, and there's a reason, because you need to cross all these hurdles, checks and balances, make sure the house that you're buying or property that you're buying is what you're buying. And that's one of the reasons why a buyer needs a buyer's representation or a buyer's agent.
So walk me through. There's going to be plenty of people that somebody's going to question. People are going to question it. They should question it. Walk me through that process walk the buyer through that process. I'm the buyer. Walk me through it.
Through a transaction?
No, just like, hey, Brandon, I'd love to work with you, but I'm thinking about working on my own.
Okay. Well, if you were in a lawsuit, for instance, let's just use an example. If you're in a lawsuit and you have the plaintiff and the defendant, right? Okay. So the plaintiff has their attorney, right? And then now it's up to you as, let's say you're the defendant. Are you going to go to the plaintiff's attorney and ask them to represent you?
Nope.
Absolutely not.
But why? I can represent myself.
Yeah, but how do you know how the process works, and are you able to navigate it? Maybe you've done it in the past, and you think it's, it's a pretty. I've done it before. I can do it again.
Well, the funny one, what's the funny line? A lawyer who has, what is it? A lawyer who represents himself has a fool for a client.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I mean, it can be done, right?
It can be.
And I think you're going to see more people attempting to do it. This is actually how I kind of see things happening. First of all, I would ask the buyer this. For one, how many homes have you bought and sold before? Most people on average, it's once every 7 years. And it's a process, not an event. There's a reason our escrow timeframes are 45 days. It's not like pushing a button online and executing a stock and you have that piece of paper. It is a tangible thing that you have to maintain, you have to improve. It changes over time. So you get a mortgage on your property, you take a loan. What happens if you you refinance that loan and put another one on it? Your title has now changed. If you go and build a fence, or your neighbor builds a fence and it's encroaching into your property, what are those consequences? The boundary line of your property has now changed and there's a potential dispute there. There's a whole host of things. The property does not stay the same over the life of the hold period. At bare minimum, there's a maintenance component. If you don't maintain your property over 20, 30 years, it will deteriorate because it is tangible. It's something you can touch. And so you said it earlier, part of what we're doing is making sure what you're buying is what you think you're buying. So did the homeowner build an addition that's illegal? Is it up to code? Is it safe? Is there structural issues? That's where our industry shifted significantly when listings went online versus being with the MLS books. So I would ask to the buyer at that point, are you comfortable enough with the process? Price is one thing. First of all, if you find the $700,000 or $1 million property, is it worth it? How do you know if it's worth it? Do you have access to comparables and things like that? Go on Zillow, that's fine. Zillow's algorithm is within 10% accuracy. All right, well, if you're willing to go off of that and you're willing to pay within 10% of actual market value, so be it, right? But our fee is, if you're gonna overpay by 10%, I could save you that and cost you a lot less money than that.
Correct.
Then the next part would be, hey, our price is only 1/4 of one page of an 18-page contract that we are usually putting together. All the rest is a lot of other things. Great, you've figured out price between you and seller, no big deal. Okay, what's the rest of the steps? Is the title clear? Do you even know what to look for with the title? Are you even aware of a title report and what it is? Do you know what a seller's disclosure, what legal obligations you're required to do, seller's required to do? How do you go through that loan process? How do you check for permits and things such as that?
The average person is not going to be able to do that.
No.
And
most agents don't know how to go down to DPP and look up plans and permits.
And you can't rely on the seller's agent because the seller's agent represents the seller.
Oh, yeah.
And he doesn't represent your business interests at all.
Yeah.
So
if you're comfortable with that process and you're confident with it, you can go down that path, right? And the question is how accurate and comfortable are you going to be? You're basically going to be doing a full-time job trying to basically put your mouth around the fire hose and turn it on. And I'll give you the example that was a light bulb moment for me was when I was doing my Haula project. And I read 13 construction books before I walked out onto that project. At no point did I ever think I was a general contractor. In fact, when I brought my buddy up, I was actually trying to work towards getting my general contractor's license. And I'm like, I gotta learn these things. I gotta get the experience. I'm hands-on working with the guys. I'm learning a lot. I was blown away at how much I learned doing that versus reading the freaking book, right? It's total concept. And my buddy shows up and I say, yeah, we're having some problems with HECO. They're requiring us to do this with the gravel and the tape. Actually, I didn't even say that. I just said, we're having problems with HECO. They're making us jump through all these hoops. He goes, oh, are they making you do the gravel and the tape? And I'm like, yeah, how'd you know that? He goes, it's standard. And I was like, oh man. And right then it dawned on me, my buddy had 30 years of experience project managing projects.
And he's been through
it.
Yeah.
And then I walked in and one of my drywall guys was doing the drywall and he was talking to him about the finish. and immediately made me realize, what the heck am I doing? I'm trying to learn the 30 years of experience this guy has, my buddy has right now. Why am I going to go kill myself trying to go through those processes hands-on when I can hire him and make my life 10 times easier?
There's a cost of good service, right?
Correct.
You know, I've worked, I mean, you've probably worked with them. We've worked with attorneys, we've worked with doctors,
Yeah.
you know, all these professionals who know the value of hiring somebody to do what their profession is.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to go try and do a minor surgery after watching it on YouTube because I think I can do it.
Yeah.
And vice versa, right? I mean, the home buying process is a very complicated process. You know,
We are going to get the DIYers.
yeah, of course,
It's going to increase.
That's going to happen, but like you said, the buyer and the buyer's agent, seller and seller, they have to be along the same values. And if that client is not value your services, not willing to pay for it, maybe that's not the client you want to work
Correct.
with. And maybe they can find another agent that is willing to work for less, right? And you get what you pay for. That's all I have to say.
I liken it sometimes to like, okay, if I was going to get into a lawsuit where I was suing someone or someone was suing me, and we're going after $1 million is on the line. Mm-hmm. Am I hiring the junior agent who's never been in litigation or only done it a couple of times? Or am I paying the $500 an hour guy who's best of breed because I want results? There's $1 million on the line. Mm-hmm. That's a value. It's a value component for me of where I would go.
Mm-hmm. But not everybody has that same, right? I mean, and we mean you as a realtor,
freedom of choice.
Yeah, as a realtor,
you
choose.
Of this lawsuit.
I mean, right? So just like the buyer and the sellers get to choose. Yeah. The agents they work with, the agents also get the choice of the buyers and sellers that they work with.
Yep. The one thing I was going to say though, let's flip this around. Mm-hmm. Buyers start coming unrepresented to me as the listing agent. I know there's a 70% fail rate. First of all, if someone comes in wanting to represent themselves, how is it beneficial for the seller to get into escrow with that person?
I don't think it is
with
beneficial.
The risk.
Yeah.
Correct.
I mean, it's a lot of risk. Yeah.
Yeah. So now look at it on this side in the sense that for me, I'm going to have a conversation with sellers at this point going, hey, listen, we have to be very careful with buyers that are unrepresented because one, on average, people buy and sell once every 7 years. That's not very good practice, right? Mm-hmm. That's a very inexperienced person. You're not going to have open heart surgery with a doctor that does open heart surgery on a person once every 7 years.
Yeah.
You'd run, right? It's the same thing. That's why there's a 70% fail rate. So the only way that we would test the waters with someone who is unrepresented is if I'm going to negotiate and manipulate that situation to where it's significantly in the favor of my client, the seller. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, if my client has to be sold in 3 months, we run the potential of wasting 45 days with someone who has who's a significantly more risky buyer and could fall apart. That's not very advantageous.
Versus a buyer.
Unless you're going to overpay by a significant amount. Yeah. Even then, there's risk that it will fall apart.
Versus a buyer that comes in that is represented.
Correct.
By an agent that maybe you know and trust.
Correct.
As a listing agent, and you're comfortable working with them, and you know that price is one thing, but getting to the finish line is another.
Correct.
Right? So.
Oh yeah. I always tell people, hey, our place, we're on the market for $1 million. Hey, someone can offer you $2 million. I don't care. If they can't get to the finish line, it's nothing. Yeah. Doesn't mean anything. Yeah. Right?
Correct.
So, and I always talk in extremes to kind of get points proven and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But it also goes back to our industry, which is when I was talking about agents who do enough deals to know who the players are in the market, that goes directly to that. If I know that agent, know how they operate, know how professional they are, how knowledgeable and experienced they are, I know they have the ability to move their client through that process. That's someone you're going to more likely want to work with than either newer, inexperienced agent over here or unrepresented buyer over here.
Well, definitely. I don't think we stress that enough to our clients. The relationships that we've built with other realtors in our industry
are intentional.
Over 2 decades hold a lot of value.
They do.
Right?
We're losing that art, by the way.
What do you mean?
So the older, more experienced agents, and it's geographical on this island too. And I don't want to get into which part doesn't. But the newer agents want to negotiate by text. They don't want to talk.
Yeah.
They want to email or text. I had an agent last week tell me, I said, listen, this is a very unique situation, a very unique contract. Can we get on the phone to discuss this? Because when I get on the phone, that's mastery of my craft at that point after 21 years. I'm listening to how you answer my questions. I'm feeling you out. This is negotiation. That's the art of sales at that point, where we're communicating. How do we
Can't
get
negotiate through a text.
You
right?
cannot.
Yeah.
It's one-way communication. Same thing with email. She emailed back, said email is preferred. And I'm like, how? So she actually lost the deal for her client on the sell side because she wouldn't pick up the phone. We now went away because you basically made a demand that drew a line in the sand. I could have walked us through that and gotten the two parties to where we are, where we could have met, but she refused to pick up the phone. In doing so, we had to walk away. They've now reduced the price below where we would have been willing to go. So
yeah, there's a whole generation gap there with the whole forms of communication. There was a time where we didn't have cell phones or pagers or the
Fax
internet even.
machines.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to literally get on the phone
and walk a
hash it
contract
out,
to someone.
right, and negotiate the deal.
Yeah.
You know, so
A lot of that was face to face too.
right, you know, in the mainland they still do a closing table, right, for the buyer and seller meet. You know, but I don't. It's bad business practice if you're just trying to do everything over a text or email. I think.
Yeah. So will commissions be reduced?
You know, commissions. There's always been pressure on commissions. At one time we started at this amount, and now we're at this amount. In 10 years from now, we'll be at this amount. You know, and there's always going to be pressure on commissions, but there's always going to be people that are willing to pay for good service. So you always have the option, right? You can shop at Walmart or you can shop at Neiman Marcus. You know, it's really up to the consumer.
Yeah, so it's interesting because for the past probably 10 years, I've not had a standard compensation rate. My compensation has, this is how I determine compensation. What am I going to do? What resources am I putting in? What kind of time and energy? How long is this going to take? How realistic is what you're wanting to do? Okay, based on that, this is what it's worth to me. Here's my fee. It's never been a set standard fee, which is a little bit about what the lawsuit has been about, is commission rates being some standard component and whatnot. But for example, on the buy side for me, I do a lot of move management, relocation, people moving from the mainland, transitioning here. Well, I mean, I'm working with people who are coming from cold Northwest environment, 4,000 square foot home, and downsizing to a 1,500 square foot condo here, and they're not familiar with the island. I have to have a conversation to walk them through that process of purging. What do you bring? What do you don't bring? How do you handle your pets, shippers, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, then you get here. Is there a rental component? Is there getting familiar with the island, neighborhood tours, et cetera, et cetera? And then going through the whole home, we find the right home and going through that whole process. Yeah, we're not even haven't bought the home yet. Take that compared to my neighbor who goes to an open house, calls me up and says, Scott, I walked in this open house. I want to buy this home. I already know the neighborhood. I want you to help me buy the home. Okay, well, should my fee be the same? To me, absolutely not. The one that's way more involved, the relocation side, should command a higher fee because there's way more, not only knowledge and experience, there's an expertise there, but there's also time and energy that goes into that versus the other one.
I talked to an agent this morning. When she takes listings, she charges considerably higher than the rest of the market is charging. And the way she does that, she sits down with the client and she talks about all the services she's going to provide. She's a very successful agent, by the way. And she continues to be successful doing that because she shows her value to that client.
Well, that's what it is. It's value.
Yeah, it's value. And the client says, okay, well, that makes sense. And they're focusing on the net. They're not focusing on the commission. Right?
Correct.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier.
So will buyers' commissions be reduced?
I think buyers' commissions will be reduced, but it's going to be up to the buyer whether or not they want to, pay that extra for that extra services. So I think there always has been pressure on commissions in general. Buyers agents over time will be reduced, and it's not going to happen right away. It's not going to happen overnight. It's inevitable, but so as realtors, we need to elevate, we need to show our value, we need to talk about all the things that we're going to do, and we're going to need to show our value again and have it make sense to the buyer or the seller to pay our fees. And it goes back to saying, like, not every buyer or seller is going to be a good fit, right?
Yep.
Maybe that seller is not willing to pay that fee that you charge, and that's okay too. There's lots of options out there.
Yeah, so for me, I don't see my compensation on the buy side being reduced because, like I said, I haven't had a standard compensation. I've based it on my time and energy, and if somebody is not interested in that, great, that's fine. I'm not willing to do it. I base mine totally custom based on the situations that are there. So for me, what I offer is not going to change in charge. I do see it in the industry where 90% of the industry doesn't, 94% of the industry doesn't do enough to make a living, which means most of them don't have necessarily the same knowledge and experience as someone who's been in the business like us for over 2 decades. And they don't have as much value to be able to add. So how do you offset lack of knowledge and experience? Hey, I can do it cheaper than the other guy. And so again, the consumer, the main thing that I try to tell the consumer on these things, or want the consumer to get out of this portion, is listen, be careful. You pay for what you get. Interview, see if they're the right fit. Please don't put your eye on the commission. Make sure it's going to be on the net, because those people that are in the top 6% or even the top 2%, I would argue, are worth their weight in gold. If I was, whatever my fee is I charge, I already know I'm going to make or save you far greater than that. What is that? If you focus on the compensation, you're most likely giving up on the net, and you got to be careful of that. But it comes down to the individual agent you're looking to hire.
Correct.
So in summary, what are your thoughts?
I mean, in summary, commissions and compensation has and always will be negotiable. These changes, I think, are for the better. It's going to elevate our industry, make us all better professionals. At the same time, the people that aren't able to keep up, or the agents that aren't able to keep up with the industry and show their value and services to their clients, may not be able to stay in this industry, which for the consumer, I think will result in better services and a more elevated level of service and more due care when they're helping them through the transaction.
Yeah, I think this is the first step in a right direction. I do like the representation agreement. I have always had an issue with the compensation. It's always been a weird thing to me ever since I've gotten into the business, which is, why is the seller paying my compensation? And how I phrase that is, again, the guy that's moving from that I'm helping with move management and relocation services, and have all this time, all this energy and effort and resources put into it, versus the person that calls me up and says, hey, I found the home, write up the contract, let's get this done.
You're paid
if they're buying the same property, I'm getting paid the same, and the seller is paying me. Why is the seller paying me my compensation? My compensation should be determined by the services that I provide and to you, and we agree on a fee, on a fee that's reasonable for both of us. I would never invite a contractor over to my property and say, hey man, I want you to build this 4,000 square foot home, and by the way, my neighbor's gonna pay you. Like, the concept of that doesn't make any sense to me. So I understand why it was there. You gotta understand the history of how all this came about, which leads us to why this lawsuit came about. But I do think it's a step in the right direction. In the beginning, first part, I think the solution is worse than the problem, because I don't think this is the end of where we'll end up. I actually think there's going to be other lawsuits that come out of this, dual agency, for example. So all the people wanting to represent themselves, you're going to see more people representing themselves. And then you're going to see agents doing dual agency, and you can't represent both people. And I think you're going to see a class action lawsuit that comes out of dual agency, and then that will get split apart. But the good parts are buyer representation agreement, direct discussion about services and fees, The confusing part for the consumer is how this compensation gets paid and having to navigate and negotiate that through during the process. And the other frustrating part to me is you're trying to change the industry in 3 months. That's a very hard thing to do. It is going to be bumpy. It's going to affect the consumer, and who you hire matters. So the more seasoned, the more educated, and the sharper agent that you hire will make that process much smoother for you and will be worth their weight in gold.
I agree.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. You're 2 decades in the industry and have a wealth of knowledge, and I highly respect you. We have similar paths. We have similar beliefs. And I respect your opinion, and I look to you. We can banter a lot and kind of talk about things. So appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate you. I'm honored that you would ask me to be on your podcast. I appreciate that.